Okay, what's
And
that?
we'll send you a copy of James's concert last
Well,
night.
that'd be great.
VHS.
What other artists do you got?
Okay.
For interviews?
Yeah.
I just
Like
interviewed
that?
Quincy Jones the
Yeah,
other day.
that's perfect.
For this?
For
Without
the
Okay.
any
show, for the
move or
Soul
anything.
Show.
Okay.
Interviewed Quincy, Ben E. King, which was just like one of the highlights of my life.
Great singer.
He
boy.
Oh,
great.
and he
Sweet
came to
guy.
the show last
He came
night.
by last night and said hi.
Oh, he was such
There
a...
is a rose in Spanish Harlem.
Oh.
Doo-doo-doo.
His speaking voice is just, the best. Ruffin and Kendricks. Gosh, who else did we
Who
interview?
else did we do?
Jerry Wexler.
Jerry Wexler, Robert Palmer.
Robert Palmer.
Quincy Jones, Peter Wolf, and maybe with Keith Richards, if we can work it out for this week.
And of course James Brown.
Say hello to Keith for me if you...
Yeah, we'll do. He's supposed to be back in town on Wednesday.
Okay, I'm rolling.
Gosh, I was just getting ready to ask a question too. Oh, we've been talking a lot about James Brown. In that whole genre of 60s soul artists, Peter, who else do you consider to be the greats along with James?
It's really tough because, what comes to mind, of course, is, when you say, there was of course Ray Charles and Otis Redding, but there was really, I was so into it. There was so many artists that, even some artists that would just have like one record, or even someone like Slim Harpo, who I mentioned, was, sort of, there's the kind of, if you like, say, in rock and roll, make a list, and you say, oh, you got Jerry Lee, and then you forget, oh yeah, that's Buddy Holly. There's so many people, it's really very hard to do that. But what was great about music, and that whole thing, that since it did come from this kind of feeling of, honesty and credibility, this great, incredible instruments, but there was a real credible factor. When I would go to clubs, where unfortunately a lot of these artists were forced to play because they couldn't quite break into the white, major, or when I say white, the middle of the road or a larger spectrum of audience. They did what they call these circuits. Some of the guys call them Chitlin circuits, and there was one circuit here in New England where we're talking, where it was like in. They would go to Baltimore and play out in Philly, and then hit up into Rhode Island and hit into Boston. And I remember seeing people like Benny King, Otis Redding, Slim Harpo, just B.B. King. All these great artists would come into these clubs. And but what was great was when you would see a performance, that there was a feeling of belief between artist and audience. And I remember once there was one of the artists, it was pretty notable, very famous artist, wasn't James, and he was sort of getting into a little more Vegas, and he was performing in a club, and he was getting into doing some standards, and the audience was screaming, man, get down, and he stopped the show and said, listen, man, don't force me to change, I'm doing this new stuff. But there was a sense that if you really didn't give an audience what they wanted, you found out about it. And especially when you would be in a concert of, like in the Apollo Theater in New York, the audience was tough. And they would talk back to a performer. I mean, they would start yelling at a performer. If a guy didn't quite hit a note, the audience let the performer know he wasn't in top form. And but there was a real great sense of conviction that was very powerful, that a lot of the rock and roll music didn't have. There was a sense of just seeing this performer singing that was just this amazing emotional transference that would just get to you. It was like seeing, like certain jazz artists have. When you see a John Coltrane performing, there was a real spiritual feeling involved. And with many of these great soul artists, there is that spiritual feeling that transcends. And it was, I remember in talking about soul, there was this, Don Covey put together a group called the Soul Clan. I remember going to see, and it was many years, several years ago, and it was Wilson Pickett and Solomon Burke and Benny King, and it was just, they were playing in this auditorium in New York, and it was something very upsetting to me, seeing these great American artists, and because of the certain prejudices that were deep in the music industry in this country in the 50s and 60s, that they were sort of forgotten. And also they were forgotten by a lot of, these great artists were taken by many record companies, built into stars with A&R people and a lot of songwriters. And then record companies sort of lost interest in them. I thought, well, they're a little old-fashioned, and moved on to younger artists, and sort of just left them adrift. And, you know, it's sort of, a lot of these soul artists were like Hollywood stars in the 30s. They just didn't know how to work independently. They worked within a studio. They worked within a record company, where was the record company had their A&R people that would help them with songs and with different musicians. And when that all broke down, a lot of these great artists were sort of somewhat at a loss. And what was really tragic was people in the United States, black and white, totally lost interest. Most people, I shouldn't say everyone, of course, I didn't, and there was a lot of other people didn't, but generally in the States, most people lost interest in these artists, and they had to go to Europe or Japan, and there they were treated with the adulation that they deserved. But in this country, man, they couldn't, you know, get arrested. It was terrible.
Why do you think, what do you think separated someone like James Brown from sort of the group that you mentioned that made him be able to cross over and keep on going through the generations?
Well, James had, you know, not unlike Sinatra, had, you know, peaks and valleys in his career, but he was always able to every couple of years, bang, pop back in there and do something that put him right back. I think that there was also maybe his more involvement in the business and enabled him to sort of prevent some of the undercurrents that hurt a lot of these performers. I think it was an individual feeling of, you know, determination with James. Plus, James, you know, insisted upon a certain sense of respect from his music, and I think he demanded it. But he too had a hard time for a long while. And even he too went through periods of searching different forms. I remember when James would appear and was trying, you know, different kinds of music, a smaller orchestra and just, you know, lighter kinds of stuff, and which every artist goes through, you know. Fortunately, he's been able to, you know, follow through and remain at the top, but it hadn't been easy for him, and it's unfortunately, you know, I think only until recently has this resurgence and interest in James started again, which I think is great, because his talent was there. I mean, it's someone like Ray Charles. I mean, Ray Charles is good now, if not better, than he was 20 years ago. And if Otis Redding was alive today, he'd be a far greater musician. These are great artists. These are not just cats that plugged in. These are great American artists. And it's a sense where the soul artists in America really, you know, for them to survive and last for the amount of years that they have, you know, it wasn't easy. You know, you see a lot of rock bands, and, you know, I myself included, you know, you travel through city, and there's been certain comforts and luxuries of, you know, having you know, a notoriety and having a certain fame, and a lot of these artists that, you know, man, you know, I feel it next to these guys. You know, man, I wouldn't even, you know, couldn't even hold a candle to some of the range that these artists have, and, you know, to see, you know, like I remember once. Well, you know, I was very friendly and very close with Muddy Waters, and when Muddy would come to Boston, he would stay with me, and we became very close. And we were playing Detroit, Cobo Hall. You know, I don't know how many people, you know, how holes, but thousands of people. And afterwards, I'd, you know, zero over the other side of town and see Muddy Waters in a club. It was nauseating. It was totally nauseating, you know, and it was like totally perverse to me. And a lot of what these artists have gone through, their stories, and the trials and tribulations, as James would say, was enormous difficulties, you know. And it was, you know, I think for an artist like a Bobby Bland, an artist like, you know, in the days of Ed Sullivan and these great variety shows, and you would have on a, you know, a singer, some, you know, pop singer or some guy, man, that couldn't even hit a, you know, a 4-note range. I mean, it must have destroyed these guys. I mean, because you know what it was. It was just this terrible, terrible, terrible racial, you know, situation. That fortunately, I think, as the new audiences are coming on with the popularity of, you know, many new artists, it's changed. But I remember even touring, seeing a group like the Allman Brothers with a mixed, you know, band, black and white people in the same group. It was a difficult thing. They went through a lot of weird problems, especially being Southern. You know, it was just a strange, sick, unfortunate part of our history. And I think it's important to express, because it's part of the story that went on, and it's part of the reason for the intensity of the music, and I think it's part of the victory and the, you know, prevailing for a lot of these artists. Because if you don't touch it, if it's just like, oh man, James Brown was great and he had a, you know, influence on me, but not to talk about the trials and tribulations that makes James Brown even greater, because he prevailed.
I was doing a show for December on the evolution of Southern music, and I had the opportunity to spend some time talking to Steve Cropper, who I consider to be a great musician. And one of the things that we talked about, I talked to him about a lot, was color in music then and now, and with him being with Booker T and traveling around, and he talked a lot about having to deal with that race discrimination, because he said, when you're a musician, you just aren't aware of it. You know, he had no idea that Booker T was black, you know, and then they would go places and have to cope with it. So, do you think it's still prevalent today at all? Is there still color in music, Peter? Or have we almost gotten rid of it, do you think?
Oh, I think we got rid of a lot of it, but I think it's still there. You know, I think it's, you know, I've been told certain things by, you know, people, well, man, it's good, but it sounds too black. You know, what does that mean? You know, and I'm sure, you know, certain black artists have been accused of trying to sound too rock. You know, a man used to be black. You know, and I know it's interesting when you talk with producers and you know, being, you know, a rock and roller. This, you know, if you're talking to a black producer, you know, there's a sense of like, man, you know, we want to get funk, but you don't think a black producer can understand rock and roll, and it's insane. You know, because it's if you're a musician, you can understand, be it country or you know, soul music or rock music, and it's just got groove, or it's, you know, it's like Duke Ellington said, "Don't mean a thing, let's get that swing." But there is a discrimination. I think it still exists. I think it's, you know, easier for, you know, mainly white artists to a general degree, and I think it's changing. I think it's getting for the better, but there's still, you know, that issue, and there's right here where we're talking from in Boston, and just in, you know, Philadelphia the other day, you know, there was a family chased out of the neighborhood because they're black. You know, it's still a part of this culture.
How did you were talking about Muddy a second ago? How did somebody like Muddy continue when it was just in playing clubs? Was it because he thought of himself as a musician instead of a star? Do people today, are they more interested in being stars than musicians?
I'm not quite sure if I understand your question.
Did Muddy, you were talking about Muddy, you know, and him, you know, plugging away and just continuing to play in small clubs and seeing him in a small club. I mean, how was that? Because he wasn't, I mean, could he do that because he was more concerned about being a musician than he was being a star?
Well, when you talk about someone like Muddy Waters playing in a club, or why some of these artists played in clubs, the reason that they played in clubs is they had no other choice. You know, it wasn't like they were trying to get close to the people. It was that they couldn't get anywhere else, so they were forced to play in clubs. Artists like Muddy Waters, you know, who was a blues artist, there was a point in the 60s where even a lot of black audiences really rejected a lot of their own roots, and there was a lot of the hootenannies that were going on, a lot of the folk revivalists that brought Muddy back. And then after the a King and even things like James, or, you know, I'm black and I'm proud, and there was a reconsciousness and sense of roots by black America. then people like Muddy Waters was sort of considered important. But there was a long time where, you know, young northern black kids rejected a lot of the southern music because they thought it was just, you know, something that had nothing to do with them, and it was like, you know, antiquated. You know, it was older style, but it was a real rich style that led into what eventually became Motown and what eventually became James Brown.
How much do you think that rock and roll owes to soul music?
Oh, it's rock and roll is dance music, and rhythm and blues invented dance music. And what rock and roll did was borrow the intensity from rhythm and blues. And I think, you know, I can't say it was just re-channeled for white audiences, because that's unfair to someone like Elvis Presley, who I think James Brown would be the first one to tell you was a great artist. And it's unfair to someone like Jerry Lee Lewis or to a Roy Orbison. But in a whole, there's no way there could be rock and roll without rhythm and blues or soul music. It just wouldn't have happened.
Were you a big Aretha fan? Are you a big Aretha fan?
Yeah, Aretha, matter of fact, I just had one of the great pleasures, honors, and experiences was doing a little duet with Aretha on her last album. So that was quite an experience, because, you know, you get into a studio and you see someone that magnitude, you know, with that kind of instrument, you know, just sort of walk in and go, woo, you know, boom, there's this instrument, and bang, take one, it's there. And it's, you know, each take is, you know, just, you know, a magnificent performance.
Have you ever had a chance to work with James Brown?
I never worked with James. I don't think I could work with James. I mean, I wouldn't be able, I don't think, get a note out, you know, next to James. I had the honor to share a dais with him. What do you call it? One of these, like, dais. Yeah, thanks. I'm not good at those functions at the junction. There was one of these rock seminars, new music seminars, and I was with James and African Bambaataa, and it was with Lou Reed, Madonna, and it was an artist panel. And I got to meet James through people at Tommy Boy Records and stuff when he did that duet with African Bambaataa. And yeah, so I got to meet James, but it was, again, he was such a major, and still is such a major influence on me. And I still, to this day, I remember being on the road and with the Giles Band, be touring and, you know, doing these one-nighters, and, you know, just be like real tired, maybe stayed up a little bit too late the night before, and sitting in the dressing room, and it'd be about a half hour of the showtime. You know, I would just take the cassette of James Brown Live at the Apollo Volume 1, and boy, man, there's no drug in the world that can lift you like that tape can lift me, and it still does it. You know, it's magic. It's classic. It's right there in the grooves.
Thanks, Peter.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you. You make my job easy.
Oh, good.